1999 spoke to me about what he wanted was a British dream for Britain, based on the American dream. But the real British dream that existed in the past was based on a unitary idea of empire, of which Britain was never a part of the British Empire, but it was one of an idea of England's power and Scotland as an ideal of simple living and highland and Gaelic traditions which were dying. The crofters, the herdsmen were all being cleared out because of the need for country estates, primarily by the lairds and English gentry, and the Highlanders had fought at Culloden were put into the British Army and sent to India to fight. Whilst in Britain itself, in England itself, there was tensions. The Norman invasion of Britain had changed the class structure, although the Anglo-Norman elite were eventually assimilated by the resisting Anglo-Saxons. Now the Norman elite were Nordic and Celtic, and the Anglo-Saxons were Nordic and Celtic. So the cultural distinctions were only stark because of the French language which the Normans spoke. They both branches come from the Scandinavian tree of different families, which the Germanic people were not included in because they came from Asia and the Hunnic tribes. Now, as I said in part one, the Germanic people were brought over by the Nordic and Celtic English to Britain, where they faced the Romano-Celtic peoples of Britain, of lowland Britain, which went right up into the north, into the south of Scotland. To the north of this was the Gaelic Highlanders and other tribes and Picts, which split Scotland ethnographically. And then later on, there was the invasions of the Isles by the Vikings, who are Norse, who in Shetland particularly, where they mix with the Gaelic peoples there. And so Scotland itself is an artifice. It was created by the British Empire. Its unity was created by the English, who created the British Empire, and the manorial system imposed on the Scots, and which was then melded with the cruel feudalism of the Gaelic tribes and Highlanders, created a system of class inequality, which was even worse than in England itself. England was a very unequal and unfree place to be in the Victorian and Edwardian times. People even disassociated themselves if people married into servant classes or other things, and that was because of the establishment at the time was very much based on Freemasonry and ultra conservatism, which Gladstone and Disraeli were more moderating forces on because of Disraeli being Jewish and Gladstone being a liberal. But the British Empire was based on liberal trade, and this was the force that expanded it. And the Scottish Enlightenment also had something to do with this. And the influence of Scottish intellectuals on Britain has been profound because of the power of Edinburgh's thought and thinkers. But after 1945, because of Churchill and Attlee, these class distinctions were dropped, and a more cohesive British idea, a British dream, was developed based on social democracy, which swept away the old order, the old Milner and Rhodes crowd who caused the war in South Africa, and their group of people were replaced by the university system. Now, in Scotland, this didn't happen so equally. In Scotland, the Scots had developed their own university system, their own laws, their own judiciary, And these distinctions were kept rather than being changed so profoundly as they were in England. But what does this do in actual real day life? We can talk about Hengist and Horsa, we can talk about the old pre-1945 establishment being swept away in England, but what does this mean for ordinary people? People like myself. My family had some Scottish roots because of the Dundee and Millwall jam factory. They moved down to London and became what late on the Millwall docks, and then later became part of the Millwall football club, you know, in that area in Bermondsey. So the Scottish influence on London has been profound as well. But the Scots have been distinct in their political and bucked the trend, because the Germanic people generally have been more conservative wherever they've settled, whereas the SNP is distinctly liberal, and the Labour contingent and Labour vote in Scotland is very strong. So Scotland is both racially and politically distinct from England. That's what I'm trying to say. What does that mean, again, for people who live in Scotland? Well, people have had to emigrate from Scotland because of the sectarian tensions between the Protestant Germanic population and the Celtic Catholic population. Part of that may have been to do with my forebears, who were Nordic and Celtic but were Protestant, and they had to move because of economic reasons as well, and industrial reasons from Dundee. Although my other parts of my family are firmly English, so I am an English man, because I am Nordic and Celtic. But what does this mean for people who live in Scotland now? It means that when Celtic call upon and hail the IRA, or the Unionist Rangers fans hail the UDF, that they talk about Scotland being like Northern Ireland but without the bombs yet. But as we've seen, there's clearly the arms and the potential for actual warfare in Scotland should it become independent in terms of terrorist activity. And this is something, as we found on recently, with splinter groups from the IRA, which the Irish Republicans in Northern Ireland in fact cooperated with the security services to foil this attempt, did turn out to be in Scotland, in Glasgow. A weapons cache was found. So it's difficult to see how Scotland can be independent without suffering the same fate of sectarian violence and as a threat to its social democracy. And Scotland is trying to be a social democracy, and it's also going to need the backup of the EU if it is to be a viable state. But I just don't see how this can be. It has too many different racial, political and religious tensions within it to be a viable state. Unlike cohesive small countries such as Nordic Celtic Denmark, or Nordic Celtic Norway, or Nordic Celtic England, which are mostly cohesive, or Romano-Nordic Celtic England, mostly cohesive, mostly where people have intermarried, mostly because there is a lack of a sectarian divide, mostly because there is a social democracy at work there. All these things Scotland doesn't have. It doesn't have a viable social democracy at work at present. It is about a nationalist idea for independence which isn't fully realised, although in many ways it is already independent. It's not fully realised, and when the dream dissolves, I fear there could be violence on the streets of Glasgow. That's why I called this video Scotland's Poison Chalice and Old Firm Rivalry. And now you know the racial and political reasons why those threads of history are being picked up by football fans.